Arizona Territory. 1883, the wind carried dust and whispers, but it was the scream that made Everett Dallen jerk his head toward the ridge. He had been riding the southern trail near the base of the Dragoon Mountains, just past noon, the sun blistering the backs of his hands as he guided his mare along the rocky bend. The scream came again sharp, ragged, and his heels hit the sides of his horse before he thought twice. When he crested the ridge, the first thing he saw was the wagon, or what was left of it. One wheel broken clean off, the canvas slashed open, and the oxen gone. The second thing he saw was her. She was wrestling with a man twice her size, her dress torn at the sleeve, her face streaked with blood and dirt. A second man lay dead in the dust nearby, a rock buried in the side of his head. She had done that. Everett could see the blood on her hands. He did not ask questions. He drew his rifle and fired once. The man let go of her and dropped, unmoving. She stood frozen, chest heaving, her eyes wide as they met his. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Everett swung off his horse. "You hurt?" She flinched when he got close, but she shook her head. "No." "My children," her voice cracked. "They took my children." Everett felt something shift in his chest. "How many?" "Two. Both girls. Katie is 6. Kara is 3. She tried to steady herself, but her hands shook. "They said I'd have a better life. That marrying a man out here would give my girls a future." Everett's jaw tightened. By whose measure? She blinked up at him, and for a moment the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else, something sharp, something alive. He looked at the trail hoofprints, wagon ruts heading northeast. "They cannot be more than a couple hours ahead. Come on." She hesitated. "Wait. Why are you helping me?" He glanced at her, then at the dead man on the ground. "Because you fought, because you screamed. And because no one should be left alone in something like this." She climbed onto his horse behind him, arms wrapping around his waist. "I am Phoebe Sutton," she said, voice low. Everett Dallen. They rode hard, the sun dipping lower as shadows stretched long across the canyon floor. Everett tracked the ruts with care, finding signs of a second wagon dragging east toward the old mining trail near the San Pedro. By dusk, they found the camp. 2 men. A fire. The girls bound inside a wagon, crying softly, Phoebe's nails dug into Everett's sleeve. "That's them?" He nodded, then dismounted quietly. "Stay here." "No," he turned to her. "They are my daughters. I am not hiding." Everett did not argue. He handed her a pistol from his saddlebag. "Do not shoot unless you have to." They circled wide, using the rocks and brush for cover. One of the men went off to relieve himself behind a cluster of boulders. Everett took him out silently, his hand over the man's mouth as his knife did the rest. The other sat by the fire, chewing on dried meat. Phoebe stepped out from behind the wagon and leveled the pistol. "Put it down," she said. The man turned, surprised, and Everett stepped in behind him, rifle pointed square at his chest. "Back away from the fire," Everett said. The man cursed but obeyed. Phoebe ran to the wagon and threw the flap open. "Mama," Katie yelled, crawling forward. Kara's arms were tied, her face tear-streaked. Everett kept the rifle steady while Phoebe untied them, pulled them close, and held them like she would never let go again. By nightfall, Everett had tied both men to a cottonwood tree with their own rope. He left their canteens nearby. "Someone will find them in a few days," he said. Phoebe nodded. "That is more kindness than they deserve." They camped a mile away, near a creek. Everett built the fire. Phoebe tended to her daughters, whispering soft words while brushing the dirt from their hair. Later, when the girls had fallen asleep curled beside her, Phoebe looked across the fire at Everett. Her face was streaked in shadow and flame. "I left Missouri thinking I was giving them something better," she said. "A man from a church group said he knew a widower near Tucson. Said there would be food and land. I never met the man until he came to the train station. He was cruel from the start." Everett listened, silent, letting her speak without interruption. "I stayed because I thought I had to, but when he started looking at Katie like," she broke off. "I ran. Took the girls. That was 3 days ago." "You did the right thing," Everett said. She looked at him. "You do not even know me." "I know you fought," he said. "And I know you would have died for those girls." Phoebe stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her hands, still scraped and raw. "Thank you for what you did today." Everett nodded. They said she would have a better life, but Everett looked at her now, tired, bruised, full of fight, and wondered what kind of life they meant. And if they ever measured it by what really mattered. He looked at the girls, curled in sleep, and then back at Phoebe. He thought maybe this was the start of something, not because it was easy, but because he had seen the way she had stood her ground, pistol shaking in her hand but her voice steady. Because she had not waited for rescue, she had run, fought, survived. And because somewhere between the ridge and the fire, something in him had shifted. Phoebe leaned back against the tree, her eyes closing, her daughters pressed against her sides. Everett stayed awake a while longer, watching the fire, rifle across his knees. He did not plan on leaving her. Not now, not ever. The morning came slow and gray, soft light spilling across the creek. Everett rose before the sun cut the chill, brushing dew from his hat brim and checking the horses where they'd been tied under mesquite. Phoebe stirred soon after, her daughters still wrapped in the blanket she'd tucked around them. She sat up with quiet care, her hair falling loose over one shoulder. The bruises along her collarbone had darkened overnight. Everett didn't stare, but he didn't look away either. "I need to find work," she said after a while, voice raspy with sleep. "Someplace where they won't ask much about who I was before." "There's a ranch west of Tombstone," Everett said. "Run by a couple brothers. They lost 2 hands last winter. Might be they'd take on a cook." Phoebe reached for a canteen, took a drink, then passed it to him. "I can cook, so too, not much I haven't had to learn. They've got a bunkhouse, a separate room off the back where the foreman used to sleep." He paused. "A woman with 2 young girls might be safer there than most places." She watched him, uncertain. "You'd vouch for me." "I'd ride with you," he said. "See you settled." Phoebe's fingers tightened around the canteen. "You don't owe me anything." Everett looked toward the girls. "They ought to know what it feels like to be safe. That's reason enough." The sun began to warm the edge of the ridge, and Kara woke first, blinking sleepily up at the sky. Phoebe gathered her into her lap, murmuring something quiet into her ear. Katie woke next, her small hand reaching out for her mother's without opening her eyes. Everett turned away to give them space, busying himself with the fire. He found a patch of dry moss and coaxed a thin curl of smoke from it. Phoebe joined him after, kneeling down with the girls and tearing strips of jerky for them to chew. She glanced toward the trail. "How far is this ranch?" 2 days, if we keep steady." She nodded once, resolute. "Then we ride." The road into the high desert was dry and rough. Everett kept them to the shade when he could, guiding them through cottonwood groves and along dry creeks far from the main roads. They crossed paths with no one. At midday, they rested under a bluff where the wind carved the stone into soft curves. Phoebe sat with her back against the rock, Katie tracing shapes in the dirt beside her. Kara napped in her lap. Her hands never stopped moving, checking their bags, mending a loose thread in Katie's hem, brushing grit from the girl's hair. "You have people?" Everett asked, breaking off a piece of hardtack. She shook her head. "My parents died before I married. My sister married into money and stopped answering letters after I left St. Joseph." He didn't press, but she went on anyway. "I was 16 when I met him. Seemed kind. Took me to church, brought me flowers, never raised his voice till after the wedding. By then, I was already pregnant." Everett looked away, jaw set. "And no one stepped in." They all said the same thing. "He's your husband, Phoebe, make the best of it." He let the silence stretch between them. Then quietly, "They said you'd have a better life." She met his eyes. By whose measure, he didn't answer. He didn't have to. They made camp that night in a dry wash, the wind cool and constant. Everett dug a shallow pit for the fire, tucked behind a wall of brush. Phoebe kept the girls close, whispering quiet stories until they drifted off. When she came to sit beside him, the firelight played across her features, tired but less guarded. "You married?" she asked. "No," Everett said. "Too much time on the trail. Not much to offer besides my name and a steady hand." She looked at him, considering. "That may be more than most." He shifted, hands clasped loosely between his knees. I had a brother once, died in Montana working a line shack through the winter. Got snowed in, no one came for him. She didn't speak, just waited. I went up after the thaw, found his journal. Said he kept thinking someone would come, that's what stuck. Phoebe reached out slowly and laid her hand over his. They didn't speak after that. Just sat, hands joined, while the fire burned low and the desert stars came out overhead, sharp and clear against the black. The next morning they rode west. The second evening on the trail found them riding into a draw where mesquite trees clustered thick and low, the scent of creosote rising faintly from the earth. Everett's mare tossed her head as the wind shifted, but he calmed her with a low word and turned toward a thicket of ocotillo that offered decent cover. Phoebe's face was drawn with dust and heat, but her jaw stayed set as she balanced one girl on her hip and held the reins with the other hand. As Everett swung down to start the fire, Phoebe crouched beside a flat rock and gently poured water over the girl's hands. Kara gave a tired whimper, rubbing her eyes with the back of her wrist, but Phoebe hushed her with a quiet hum, one Everett hadn't heard before, low, melodic, steady as something ancient. He watched from the edge of the firelight. Where'd you learn that? She didn't look up. My grandmother. She was born in the Shenandoah, sang to me when storms came through. The girls pressed close to her as the wind picked up again, dry and restless. Everett added wood to the fire and waited until the flames caught. Phoebe sat with the children tucked beneath her arms, her eyes distant, gaze fixed beyond the flickering light. Everett stirred the beans slowly. You could stay at the ranch as long as you like. Phoebe looked at him then, and something unreadable passed across her face. And what would I be there? Whatever you choose. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers brushed the girls' hair back from their faces, slow and careful. Then she said, I used to think freedom meant going somewhere new. But I've gone, and I never felt free once. Everett poked at the fire. Maybe freedom's not a place. Maybe it's a person who doesn't ask you to be anything but yourself. She stared at him, the silence stretching between them like stretched canvas. Then she said, That's a fine thing to say. You speak like a man who's thought on it a long time. I have, Everett said. Long enough to know I'd rather build something slow and solid than chase something that won't hold. Phoebe didn't speak again until the girls were asleep, curled in a tight tangle beside her. She stood, brushing her skirt clean, and crossed to where Everett sat with his back against a boulder. I've never had room to think about what I want, she said. It's always been what needs to happen next, where to go, who to please, what to survive. Everett looked up at her. And now, she folded her arms, not in defense, but to anchor herself. Now I know I want more than just surviving. My girls deserve to grow up in a place where they can laugh without checking who's watching. He nodded once. There's land at the edge of the ranch, near the cottonwoods. No one's claimed it. Soil's dry, but it'll turn with time. Phoebe's brow furrowed. You saying we should take it? I'm saying I'd help you fence it, plant it, build walls to hold off more than just wind. She looked down at her hands. I don't know how to ask for something like that. You don't have to, Everett said. I'm offering. Her eyes lifted to his and she studied him for a long breath. If I say yes, it's not out of owing you. I wouldn't want it if it was. Phoebe stepped closer. The distance between them thinned until the only sound was the crackle of wood and the night calling through the brush. My name before I married was Phoebe Lark, she said. It's who I was before anyone claimed me. Everett rose slowly. Then that's who I'll call you if you want it. She nodded, her voice steady. I do. And then she reached out as if it was the simplest thing in the world and took his hand. It wasn't desperate and it wasn't fearful, it was just hers. Everett's thumb brushed the back of her knuckles. We'll ride in tomorrow, the ranch ain't far. Phoebe looked toward the sleeping girls. It's not the end of the road, but it feels like the start of something different. It is, Everett said, and this time it'll be measured by what you choose. The ranch came into view mid-morning, the house low and wide beneath a line of wind-bent cottonwoods. A barn stood off to the right, its red paint worn pale by sun and time. Two corrals flanked the yard, one holding a pair of sorrels, the other empty but for a broken gate leaning on its hinges. Beyond that, the land stretched flat toward the distant ridge, cotton fields gone dry with the season. Phoebe shifted Kara's weight on her hip as Everett dismounted and called out toward the barn. A man stepped from the shadows, wiping his hands on a strip of burlap. His hair was the same dark rust as Everett's, though streaked with gray at the temples. He squinted at the newcomers, then tossed the sack aside and crossed the yard. "Didn't expect you back before the end of the week," he said. "Plans changed," Everett replied. "This is Phoebe Lark and her daughters. They're looking for somewhere quiet." The man gave Phoebe a long, appraising look, not cruel, just careful, then nodded once, slow. "We've got space in the old foreman's quarters, needs sweeping. Stove works though, you cook," Phoebe straightened. "Yes. And I can mend, clean, and handle a sick child without fuss." His mouth twitched at the corners. "Well then, I'm Silas Dallen, Everett's older, not wiser. You're welcome to try it out." Phoebe didn't smile, but her chin lifted a shade. Everett led their mare toward the stable. Phoebe followed beside him while the girls stayed close, quiet now in the presence of strangers. The quarters sat behind the main house, a small room with a narrow porch shaded by a slanted roof. A washtub leaned against the wall, half full of rainwater and dead leaves. Inside, the room smelled of dust and cedar. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a table with a chipped oil lamp set beside it. The floor creaked as Everett stepped across it and opened the window. "It's not much," he said. "It has walls that lock and a roof that doesn't sag," Phoebe replied. "It's more than I've had in years." She set Kara down gently, then bent to unroll the bedding she'd kept tied to her bundle. Katie wandered to the window and stared out at the trees. Silas returned near noon with a sack of cornmeal and a crate of jars. "Pantry's yours. We don't ask questions here, but we expect work done proper. Everett can show you the rest." Phoebe didn't thank him. She only nodded once, then knelt to sort through the jars. Later, Everett led her around the property while the girls napped in the shade. He showed her the smokehouse, the pump well, and the chicken run behind the barn. The hens scattered when Kara's laugh rang out across the yard, and Phoebe paused to watch, her face unreadable. "Silas won't say it, but he's glad for the help," Everett said. "We've been stretched thin since the spring." Phoebe reached for the fence post, brushing her fingers along the rough grain. "I can pull weight. I just want to be seen as more than someone to be pitied." "I don't pity you," Everett said. "I respect what you've done." She turned to him, her expression quieter than before. "You don't know the whole of it." "I don't need to," he said. "You're here, that's enough for me." She looked away toward the cottonwoods. "My younger daughter doesn't know what it means to sleep through the night without waking to footsteps. That's the measure I'm using now, how long they stay asleep." Everett let the silence hold between them, then said, "You'll have that here." Phoebe didn't answer, but she stepped closer. That night, she cooked cornbread in the iron skillet left behind on the stovetop. The smell drifted through the yard, and Katie set the table with 2 tin plates and a wooden spoon. Kara curled up against Phoebe's side when the sun dipped low, and Everett sat nearby on the porch, sharpening his knife beneath the lantern light. Phoebe stepped outside after the girls had been put to bed, her sleeves rolled and her hands red from scrubbing. She leaned against the porch rail, her voice low. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "No," Everett said. "I've spent enough years moving. I want something that stays." Phoebe crossed her arms. "I never thought I'd end up in Arizona. I always imagined someplace green." "It's not green," Everett said, "but it's honest. The land doesn't promise more than it gives." She gave a soft sound, not quite a laugh. "That's more than most men I've known." Everett looked over at her, the light catching the side of her face. "Not soft, but strong. You'll find it different here." Phoebe didn't argue. Instead, she stepped off the porch and into the dark yard. She crossed to the cottonwoods and stood beneath them for a long while, head tilted to the sound of the wind in the leaves. Everett stayed where he was, watching her silhouette against the trees. In the quiet, something shifted again, not sharp like that first moment on the ridge, not desperate like flight. This was softer. A weight settling, a road narrowing into something steadier. When she returned to the porch, Phoebe didn't speak. She just sat beside him and folded her hands in her lap. Everett leaned back, the lantern flickering between them. He didn't reach for her, but he didn't move away either. They sat like that until the night deepened, and the stars came out one by one, clear and bright above the desert sky. The heat broke 3 days later when a summer storm rolled in from the east. The sky turned to pewter, and the wind came in low and hard, stirring dust across the yard and snapping laundry from the line. Everett and Silas were in the far field, wrestling fence posts into ground gone stubborn with drought. Phoebe had just pulled the last loaf from the stove when the first heavy drops struck the tin roof. Katie pressed her nose to the window, watching the rain gather in rivulets along the glass. Kara giggled from under the table, where she had dragged her blanket and a crust of bread. Phoebe called them both to her side, and when the thunder began to roll, she drew them onto her lap and wrapped her arms around them, steady and sure. Everett came in soaked to the waist, hat dripping, boots caked with mud. He didn't say anything, just towed off his boots by the door and crossed to the wash basin. Phoebe handed him a towel without a word. He took it, drying his face, then glanced at her from beneath his brows. "You ever seen a sky rip open like that?" he asked, voice low. "Once," she said. "The night my youngest was born. I remember thinking the whole world might crack, but she came out screaming anyway." Everett gave a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the girls as they played with scraps of muslin on the floor. "I've been thinking about that land near the ridge," he said after a moment. "We could build something there, not just a holding pen and fence, a real place, for you and the girls. For me too, if you'd have it." Phoebe didn't answer right away. She stood, brushed flour from her apron, and stepped toward him. "You mean it?" "I don't offer what I don't intend to see through." She studied him, long and careful. The rain behind her had softened to a steady hush, and the girls were quiet now, lying on their stomachs with their chins in their hands, listening. "I'd want stone around the base," she said, "to keep the wind off, and a window facing west." Everett's chest lifted. "You'll have it." She didn't reach for him, not yet. Instead, she turned back to the girls. "Did you hear that? We're going to build a house." Katie sat up straight. "With a garden, a red door," Kara added, bright-eyed. Phoebe smiled, and Everett saw it fully this time, not the one she wore to reassure or steel herself, but something lighter, untouched by fear. They broke ground 2 days after the rain stopped. Silas lent them a wagon and the use of his 2 strongest mules. Everett cut timber from the far grove, and Phoebe gathered flat stones from the dry creeks. The girls helped carry nails in their apron pockets and sorted them by size on an old flour sack. They worked quiet and steady, side by side. Phoebe learned to square a frame, her hands blistered but sure. Everett took her lead when it came to the kitchen corner, letting her sketch out where the shelves would go, the height of the window over the basin. One night, long after the girls had gone to sleep under the stars beside their half-built walls, Phoebe sat beside him on the unfinished porch. The fire cracked low and the scent of pine pitch hung in the air. "I never let myself imagine this," she said. "Not once. I didn't think I'd ever get to choose who I stood beside." "You chose," Everett said. "And I'm here because of it." She reached for his hand this time, warm and rough from work. "Then I'm asking you, plain as I can, will you stay beside me, not just for the season, not just until it's built, but for good?" He turned toward her, eyes steady. "I came down that ridge thinking I'd help a stranger, but I found something I didn't know I'd been missing." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You never treated me like I was broken." "You weren't," he said. "You were waiting to be seen whole." The wedding was held beneath the cottonwoods, with Silas standing silent as their witness and the girls scattering wildflowers through the grass. Phoebe wore her mother's ring, which she'd kept tucked in her sewing kit all those years. Everett carved a band from mesquite and slid it onto her finger with hands that didn't shake. They moved into the house before the first frost. The window faced west, just as she asked, and the door was painted the deep red of desert clay. Katie planted beans along the southern wall, and Kara kept a small tin cup of water for the barn cat that followed them home one morning. Phoebe cooked over her own stove now, with shelves lined in jars she filled herself. Everett built a windbreak from stacked stone, and in the evenings he sat on the porch with her hand in his, the girls playing at their feet. She laughed more now. Not loud or often, but full, like something unfurled inside her and found room to stretch. When winter came, they hung quilts across the doorframe and filled the root cellar with squash and cornmeal. Everett taught the girls to whittle, and Phoebe braided rugs from the scraps of their old lives. They never spoke of Missouri or the trail east of the Dragoon Mountains. Not because they needed forgetting, but because what they had now was enough. And when Phoebe kissed him in the quiet of that small, warm house, her hands tangled in his shirt, her breath soft against his cheek, it wasn't a promise of safety. It was a promise of belonging. For the first time in her life, Phoebe Lark Dallen knew what it meant to be home, and she never left it again.